It is said that once we're adults, we remember little of our life before the age of 10. The scientific term for this is childhood amnesia. Some people talk about not remembering certain events in their childhood. They might look at old photo albums of their earlier years and get a sad look on their faces. Often they don't remember certain family gatherings or birthdays. I'm not one of those people, but I often pray that many of my earlier memories would vanish. You might ask why. It's because I grew up an orphan. I never got to meet my biological parents. Instead, I was pushed around from family to family and orphanage to orphanage. The foster system can work great if you're lucky. I wasn't. More than once did the people who'd promised to take care of me abuse me. Needless to say, I grew up quite a bad child, a troublemaker. That's why I ended up at Madame Rose's orphanage. It was a foster home for bad kids like me. It was a special place quite popular in the area I was from. An orphan couldn't find a foster home or had terrible behavior. He'd end up at Madame Rose eventually to iron out all the wrinkles. Madame Rose was a tall, haggard and stern old lady. I guess she was in her late 50s or early 60s when I moved into the orphanage. She valued nothing more than discipline and obedience. I hated her guts ever since I first met her. When she stepped up in front of me, her eyes were hard. She looked down at me with an expressionless face. The only thing she said was, "So, another one, Without another word, she led me inside and showed me the place that should be my home for the next years. The orphanage itself was a testament of times long gone. It was an old Russian mansion, most likely dating back to the time when Russia was still governed by kings. The place was vast from the outside and gigantic inside. Over the years, it must have been remodeled countless times. All these changes had transformed it into a sprawling mess of hallways. There were endless corridors and hundreds of rooms in this three-storied monstrosity. I found out that Madame Rose's orphanage was no more than a single wing of the building. It comprised the dormitories, the common room, the kitchen, and a few smaller rooms. In her stern voice, she made it clear to me that my life would be restricted to this part of the building alone. The rest, she said, was off limits for us kids. Well, I was a kid, and like all kids, I loved to explore and sneak around. The more something was forbidden, the more attractive and compelling it became to me. I spent most of my days studying or listening to Madame Rose's countless lectures on how to be a good kid. What few unattended hours of free time I had, I spent exploring the maze of hallways and rooms. Hidden and secret passages were everywhere. I found my way into the crawl spaces, explored the attic and even the musky basement. At other times, other rooms no one seemed to have entered in years or maybe even decades. They were old, dusty rooms filled with nothing but old memories. One such room I stumbled upon was the room of change. My best and only friend at the orphanage was a boy named Tiny Joe. He got this nickname because he was a scrawny little boy, shy, frail, and much too small for his age. I never found out what was wrong with him, but looking back, he must have suffered from some sort of hereditary disease. While his body was weak, his mind was always active. During my first days at the orphanage, the two of us would talk endlessly. He told me how much he loved animals, farms, fields, and most of all, tractors. He'd give him anything to be a farmer one day and drive his own tractor. We soon bonded and became brothers in crime. Whenever his health allowed it, we'd sneak out to explore the labyrinthian mess of hallways. Of course, we weren't the only kids who did this. It was just that I didn't get along with most of the other ones. I was a troublemaker, but I was far from the worst kid at Madame Rose. Not by a long shot. There was Tony, a boy who suffered from anger problems and who'd beaten more than one foster sibling to a pulp. Stefan, a creepy tall boy, had a knack for animal cruelty. None of them were as bad as Michael though. Michael was not just another bad kid. No, he was cruel, and what made it even worse, he was smart. There were also those two big guys, Rick and Cherry, who were always by his side. They were as dumb as a rock, but they looked up to Michael as a sort of role model. The worst thing about Michael was that he always preyed on Tiny Joe. Of course, the other kids made fun of him for being tiny and looking strange, but words alone didn't satisfy Michael. He struck gold when I, new to the orphanage, stepped in. From that day on, he'd found himself a new victim, especially one he could beat up. With Tiny Joe, he had to be careful. A flick against the ear here, a tiny push against the wardrobe there, but he couldn't do much more. With me, he didn't have to watch out. He once even said it to my face while Rick and Cherry held me up in front of him. Tiny Joe and I explored the rest of the mansion many times. Curiosity was one reason, sure, but sneaking out also meant that we'd be away from Michael for a while. Week after week, we'd explore the empty hallways. Nothing was interesting about the rooms we found. One day, though, by sheer accident, we found a different one. It was a playroom filled with all sorts of toys and stuffed animals. The walls were of a bright green color, and prop trees made it seem like we'd stepped into a magical forest. There was a low light from above with no discernible source. I was overwhelmed by it, and I saw how Tiny Joe's eyes grew wide. His mouth opened and he let out a squeak of sheer surprise before he rushed inside. I followed him right away. The room was amazing, out of this world. It was as colorful and lively as the rest of the mansion was bleak and dull. Everything inside was fitting the forest theme, even the stuffed animals. There were rabbits, foxes, raccoons, squirrels, and many others. I also saw a tent in one of the corners and a small hut in another. As the two of us played there, we could both see the bright lettering on the wall. The Room of Change. It was written in glowing magical letters. On another wall to our right was a rule board. There were only 2 rules on it. Don't talk about the Room of Change, and don't take anything from the Room of Change. As we played, we were oblivious to the time that passed. It was a loud, reverberating bell of the mansion that announced that it was dinner time. We both looked at each other with shock on our faces before we rushed through the mansion. Please, I prayed, don't let Madame Rose be there, please. I recited this repeatedly, but as I stormed into the common room, I almost crashed into her. She stood there looking at us in pure outrage, tapping her foot. She gave us a stern lecture in front of everyone. I could see how some of the other kids smiled and grinned at our misfortune. We were just playing in... Tiny Joe started, but I covered his mouth before he said anything. You were playing where, Joe? She asked the little boy before she turned and glared at me. And you, Mr. Reinhardt, take that hand away. She spat at me. I want to hear what Joe has to say. I lowered my hand and stared at my feet to avoid her probing gaze. Please remember the rules, Joe, I thought. Don't talk about the room. In the hallway, the tiny boy answered Madame Rose in a low voice. The old lady watched us, but after a few seconds had passed, she nodded and sent us to the dormitory without dinner. It was almost a week before we were able to sneak out again. During that time, Michael's antics had gotten even worse. It got so bad that I snapped at one point. Of course Madame Rose was in the room next door when it happened. Michael played the victim, and with Rick and Cherry backing him up, he got away, and I was the one who got into trouble. During these first months at the orphanage, I hated it all. The mansion, the other kids, the endless lectures, and especially Madame Rose herself, who always seemed to single me out. The only things I liked were Tiny Joe and the Room of Change. When Joe and I made it to the room a second time, we first thought it was a different room. The walls were bright blue with waves painted on them. Even the floor of the room was a bright blue except for a few carpet islands. There were all sorts of stuffed ocean animals, toy boats, and also an enormous palm tree. The only thing that told us it was the same room were the glowing magical letters on the wall. This time we didn't dare stay as long as before. There was no way we'd risk being late again, especially since I couldn't risk getting in trouble with Madame Rose yet again. We never said anything about the room, and neither of us took anything with us. No, we always kept to the rules. We didn't dare break them. What if the room would vanish or the door would stay closed to us forever? The room was a magical place. Each time we went there it was different. Neither Tiny Joe nor I had any idea how something like that was even possible. It was by sheer accident that the two of us learned we weren't the only ones who knew about the room's existence. One day we entered the room and found someone else inside. It was Rudolph and Martin, two boys about my age. They'd become frequent targets of Michael's as well. At first, we all were surprised to find each other there. I confronted them right away. It was my and Tiny Joe's room, I said, but the two of them replied they'd found it a long time ago when hiding from Michael. In the end, the four of us agreed on a truce. No fighting or anything like that in the room. To my surprise though, we all got along great. We even ended up playing together, and when it was time to go back, we all did so as new friends. As we made our ways through the long winded hallways, we all exchanged whispers. Each one had his own idea of what the Room of Change would be like the next time we went there. The moment we returned, our little group was noticed. Michael had his goons on the lookout for us at all times. I could only imagine how furious he was to find out that his punching bags had vanished yet again. In the next weeks, things got better. For the first time, I didn't hang out with only Tiny Joe, but also with Martin. I even warmed up to Rudolph. I would find out how wrong I was about him soon enough. A couple of days later, Martin wasn't allowed to play with us. He hadn't paid attention during the lectures, so Madame Rose forbid him from playing with the rest of us. So that day it was only Tiny Joe, Rudolph, and me who set out to find the room once again. When we arrived, the room had magically transformed into a giant farm. One wall resembled a barn, prop trees rested against another one, and stuffed farm animals littered the floor. There was even a plastic pedal tractor standing in the room's center. The moment Tiny Joe saw it, he ignored everything else and raced towards it as fast as his little legs allowed him to. I hadn't even set foot in the room when I saw him in the tractor's seat already. He was whooping with joy as he hit the pedals and started driving in a small circle. There wasn't much room to drive it, but Tiny Joe didn't seem to mind that at all. For a moment I watched him before I went to the barn to see if there was any way to enter it. It was right at this moment that the door sprang open behind us. My eyes grew wide when I saw Michael barge into the room, followed by Rick and Cherry. "So that's where you've been all that time," Michael yelled at Tiny Joe and me. "Almost forgot about that stupid place," he added, kicking a small stuffed animal aside. Rick and Cherry followed him, both grinning, and started to make a ruckus right away. They both went straight for the prop apple trees and started breaking them apart. "Thanks, Rudolph," Michael said, laughing. As I looked at Rudolph, I saw him shuffle around, looking down at his feet. The bastard. He'd betrayed us. I stormed forward to punch him, but Rick jumped in front of me and pushed me to the ground. Behind him, Cherry picked up some of the stuffed animals and started tearing them apart while guffawing like an idiot. "No, don't!" I screamed at him, but when I tried to get up, Rick pushed me down again. From where I was, I saw Michael's face distorted into a cruel smile. He'd only watched the destruction so far, but now he walked over to Tiny Joe. The tiny boy was still sitting in the tractor, frozen in fear. "Now what do we have here?" Michael started. "You know, Joe, working a farm can be quite dangerous." Tiny Joe nodded, but I could see that he fought hard to hold back the tears. "I know, Michael," he said in a low, scared voice. "Well, then you should know how easy tractors get into accidents." With that, he stepped behind the tractor and pushed it forward with full force. Tiny Joe screamed up in terror and surprise as the tractor hurtled forward and crashed against the wall. The tractor tipped over and Tiny Joe landed on the floor crying. "Oh no, what happened, Joe? Didn't I tell you to be careful?" Michael said in his most sarcastic voice. "You know what, Joe? I think it's best if we get rid of this thing." With that, he picked up the tractor and threw it to the ground repeatedly in front of Joe's eyes. The little boy was out of it. He jumped forward and tried to stop Michael from destroying the tractor. The older boy only laughed, almost giggled at Tiny Joe's attempts. Again and again he pushed him to the ground and in the end kicked him away. Soon the tractor shattered. All the while I couldn't do a thing. Rick was bigger and stronger than me and had no problem at all pinning me to the ground. Tears of anger streamed down my face as I watched the scene in front of me. Finally, Michael turned to Rick and Cherry. "Throw them out," he yelled at them. Then he focused on Joe and me. "That was the last time you ever came here." With that, Rick and Cherry pushed first me and then Tiny Joe out of the room. The little boy stumbled a few steps before his legs couldn't carry him anymore and he fell to the ground. He was still crying. "It's so unfair. Why do they have to do this? Why did they have to destroy everything?" He was out of it, crying hard, wheezing, and I could almost hear his heartbeat. I helped him and led him away from the room and the sounds of the still ongoing destruction behind the door. The moment we got back to the common room, Tony looked up and grinned when he saw that Tiny Joe was crying. "What's wrong, Crybaby? You said you're so tiny." At that moment I lost it. All the pent-up anger was released as I jumped Tony and beat down on him with my fists. I screamed so loud that Madame Rose heard it from the classroom. She came over and dragged me off Tony in an instant. "What's going on here?" she demanded to know. Before I could even say anything, she let go of Tony and me and went over to Tiny Joe. He was lying on the floor, not moving. Madame Rose's face was serious in an instant. She picked up the tiny boy, trying desperately to find out what was wrong with him. Finally, she carried him over to the infirmary. "What's wrong with him, Madame Rose?" I asked, trying to follow her. "Stay where you are, Max. And if you don't behave this time, I dare you. I dare you." She broke off. When she looked at me, I saw her lips were quivering, and I could have sworn I saw a hint of tears in her eyes. Without another word, she closed the door behind herself. It was only minutes later that we heard a car arrive. Dr. Schmidt entered the room just moments later. Without saying a word, he went straight to the infirmary to take care of Tiny Joe. I'd never been so worried in my entire life. For the next half hour, everyone in the common room was silent. No one even dared to move. "Who died?" I heard Michael say as he entered the common room, Rick and Cherry in tow as always. No one said a thing. I'd have run over to jump him if not for Madame Rose, who returned to the common room in that instant. She looked different, tired, anxious, and most of all, old. Her eyes wandered over the room before they came to rest on Michael, who was still smiling. Tiny Joe mentioned his name and told her what Michael had done. When she turned to me, I too explained to her that Tiny Joe and I had been playing together. Then Michael and his friends came to beat us up. Michael tried to wiggle his way out, of course, but while he was smart, he was still just a child. Madame Rose wasn't stupid either. She'd noticed that Michael had been teasing Tiny Joe, but so far she'd thought it was harmless. After this entire ordeal, Michael was put into the solitary room for almost 2 weeks. Sure, he studied with us and got his meals with us in the common room, but he wasn't allowed to interact with anyone. He was supposed to learn from his mistakes and even got special lectures and talks by Madame Rose. Many times I could hear her yell at him from behind the door to the classroom. Tiny Joe was transferred to the hospital after a day or 2. He'd overexhausted himself and something inside his already broken body had ruptured. After another week, Madame Rose informed us that Tiny Joe was doing much better by now. He'd not returned to the orphanage though. While at the hospital, a nurse had accepted him as a foster child, and he'd be staying with her from now on. I was a kid, so of course I was sad that I'd lost a friend. For a long while I cried in the corner of the common room. Once I'd calmed down though, I was happy that he'd found a home and that he'd not be stuck in this place anymore. When Michael was released from the solitary room, he had changed. I'd been terribly afraid as the day approached, but he was quiet and stayed by himself. He talked to Rick and Cherry a few times but avoided everyone else, and he seemed to be scared. Things changed from then on. I stayed friends with Martin and even befriended some of the other boys. When Michael's constant rule of terror had ended, we all got along better. How dumb of a kid I was to think that things would change so easily. Ever since Tiny Joe was gone, I'd not entered the room of change. It felt wrong to go there without him, and I wasn't even sure if the room was still there. After all, we talked about it, and Michael and the rest had made a ruckus inside. In time though, I couldn't fight my curiosity anymore. I snuck out of the common room one day and made my way through the hallways of the mansion. It felt strange to do this on my own. At times I even turned around to see how far behind Tiny Joe was, before I remembered he wasn't with me this time. I felt a mixture of joy and fear when I found the sturdy wooden door. It was still there. I put my hand on the handle, but somehow I was too scared to open it. What if the room was gone? What if all that awaited me behind was another empty, dusty room? I didn't get to think about it for much longer because I soon heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, I saw Michael, Rick, and Cherry. "What a strange coincidence to find you here," Michael said. "What do you want?" I asked, annoyed. "It's because of you I got in trouble," he said in a low, angry voice. "What do you mean? You were the one who pushed and beat up Tiny Joe." Right at this moment, Rick and Cherry came forward and grabbed me. There was no way I could resist them. Then Michael opened the door to the room of change. This time the room was held in a darker, almost nightly theme. The walls were covered in glowing stars, and stuffed moons and planets littered the floor. Rick and Cherry dragged me inside. Michael followed us and closed the door behind himself. In his eyes I could see how angry he was. He hadn't changed at all. No, He'd gotten worse. He'd been fuming all that time and must have plotted his revenge ever since he got out of the solitary room. "Hold him down." I saw something flash in the low light of the room. Michael was holding a knife from lunch in his hand. My eyes grew wide with fear. "What are you—" But I broke off as he held the knife right in front of my face. "What do you think I'm going to do?" "I'm going to cut you up," he answered with an evil grin. "Lift his shirt," he commanded Rick and Cherry. The two of them did nothing. I saw how they both looked at each other, not sure what to do. "Didn't you hear me? Lift it up!" When he pointed a knife at them, they looked as scared as me. Without another moment of hesitation, they drew back my shirt to reveal my naked stomach. Michael grinned and then pressed the knife against my skin. He dragged it across 1 centimeter at a time. His eyes were glowing with an insane sort of satisfaction as he did it. At first there was a tingling sensation, but then I felt a stinging pain. I screamed up and tried to get away, but Rick and Cherry held on to me. Michael took the knife away and I could see a tiny red line on my stomach. As I saw it, I freaked out. I twisted and struggled against my captor's grab, but there was no hope. "Oh, that's just the beginning." Michael, we really shouldn't," Cherry started. "Shut up, fat ass. I tell you when to." He broke off as all four of us heard a noise erupt from the room. Then the light of the room became a tad bit dimmer. "Who dares to defile the room of change?" A voice thundered from behind us. Rick and Cherry both screamed up in surprise and released me. I came to my tumbling feet and was about to rush to the door when Michael grabbed my arm. I turned around to get free and froze. A towering figure shrouded in darkness stood behind Michael. All I could see was an emotionless white mask. Before I could even yell or lift the knife again, the figure grabbed onto him. In surprise, he let go of me. The knife fell from his hand and clattered to the ground. The figure pulled him to the back wall. It opened up, and before I could say anything, the figure as well as a screaming Michael had vanished behind it. It was at this moment that I ran from the room, pushing Rick and Cherry aside. Once outside, I didn't understand what had happened. Had the room punished Michael? It was only seconds later that the door opened again. Rick and Cherry stormed out, both screaming and crying, their faces white as a sheet. For a brief moment, my eyes met the mask of the dark figure before the door to the room closed. As imposing as the figure had been, in that last moment I saw it, it hadn't seemed scary or evil. No, I felt as if it was the embodiment of the room of change itself who'd rescued me. That night I slept better than ever before. When I got up the next day, everything was back to normal, except Michael wasn't around. The moment Rick and Cherry saw me, they both hurried away. It was later that day that Madame Rose told us that Michael wouldn't be staying with us anymore. He left for a different orphanage that morning. Many of the kids in the room smiled, and some even laughed in happiness at the thought of being rid of him. Madame Rose's stern, angry glare shut him up in an instant. I was about to say something, but in the end I stayed quiet. I never mentioned what had happened the day before to anyone. After Michael was gone, things changed, but not as much as I'd hoped. The orphanage never became a happy or lovely place. It didn't matter how many friends I made with Madame Rose around. She was as strict and stern as always. For the year and a half I spent at the place, I never developed an ounce of sympathy for the old lady. As time passed on, things got better for me. My stay at the orphanage ended when I was adopted by a friendly couple who took care of me ever since. After all that had happened with Tiny Joe and Michael, and especially because of the discipline Madame Rose had hammered into me, I had changed. I had learned how to behave, and in time I grew to love my new foster parents. It's now been almost 20 years since I left the orphanage. I'm writing this all down because I recently learned what really became of Tiny Joe. Madame Rose had told us he'd found a foster home, but she'd lied to us. I learned the truth from an old newspaper while doing research. An article mentioned the unfortunate death of a tiny orphan boy, only 6 years of age. He'd died at a local hospital because of complications. It was during the same year that we'd stayed at the orphanage together. It was a week later that I paid his grave a visit. I'd brought some flowers, and for a while I told him about my life. I suddenly remembered the old orphanage and decided to pay it a visit. Once there, I saw that the place had closed down. At the city hall, they informed me that it had been closed after Madame Rose's death. The old lady had no relatives, and so the property was transferred to city ownership. In the end, no one knew what to do with the old building. Even 20 years ago, it hadn't been in great condition, and now it was almost ruined. It was during this talk with the city administration that I remembered the room of change. It wasn't hard to enter the old place. To my surprise, the front door wasn't even locked. Nothing remained of the place's former glory. When I'd been living there, it had been a magnificent place. Now all I could see was dust, dirt, and spider webs. The many winding hallways seemed odd and constricting to an adult. The first thing I found was the old common room. There was none of the furniture left, but nostalgia flooded over me. Then I went on my search for the room of change. I must have wandered through the hallways for hours before I stood in front of the door. As I opened it, I was greeted by a room that seemed almost small. It was as old and musky as all the others. Now as an adult, I recognized the backdrop on the walls. I smiled as I saw it was a mountainous theme this time. The carpet on the floor was as white as snow, or at least that's what it must have been years ago. A few prop stones were positioned against the walls. I found a single stuffed animal, a mountain bird, discarded in a corner. As I picked it up, I noticed something else on the wall behind the backdrop. When I moved the fabric aside, I found a door that was almost perfectly fused with the wall. The door led to a different room. When I moved my flashlight around, I was confused for a moment. Then I realized what this room was. It was a sort of back room, like in a theater. There were countless backdrops here, a variety of props, and an innumerable amount of stuffed animals. As I paced the room, I noticed another door. When I opened it, I stepped into an old bedroom. A quick glance around told me that this must have been Madame Rose's former quarters. At this moment, I understood the truth. The room of change was right behind Madame Rose's quarters. It hadn't been a magical or supernatural place like we kids had thought. It was something the old lady had created for us. She was a stern old teacher and caretaker. She taught us bad kids manners, discipline, and how to behave. I guess it must have been necessary for her to keep up this facade, so we'd respect and even fear her. It was her own way of teaching us. This room, though, proved how dearly she must have loved all of us deep inside. She must have created this room, knowing that we'd find it eventually. It was a place where we could find the happiness we needed so desperately, and she couldn't give us openly. As I walked through the back room, looking at all the backdrops, I could only imagine how hard it must have been for this old lady to change the room herself. Long after we'd gone to bed, she was dragging the backdrops and everything else inside, all to change the room into a different, unique nature. I felt the tears coming to my eyes as I realized what she'd done. Suddenly, I remembered the dark figure I'd seen that day, the figure that had saved me and taken Michael away. Searching through the back room proved my suspicions to be true. As I held the mask in my hands, it was clear that this figure had been no other than Madame Rose herself.